The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, and Secretary Strickland, thanks for working on Spectrum stuff together. I appreciate that. And I just wrote this down, Mr. Shadi. You just said this. You said that they've tried to work through international organizations. I know this isn't really on the subject I wanted to go, but I know when Mr. Shimkus asked about whether Ukraine was going to be RU versus whatever Ukraine. You said that's up to you follow the UN on that. So is there a little inconsistency there? I'm going to just have a question. And real quick, because I really want to get to my...
Country codes in many ways are set by standards, ISO standards that come out. So that we don't make up countries, we follow the country code model that...
and Mr. Scalise quoted Bill Clinton, said President Clinton, I'm sorry, and Heritage Foundation. Ms. Eshu, my friend from California, kind of said the issue over here, and she didn't really quite, she put it over here on us, was that our concern was the countries could take over, countries we don't want taking over the internet, take over use of the internet. And I understand Secretary Strickland said it can't happen, and really not a mechanism for that to happen, will not happen, will not accept it. And so kind of the concern, I know that you had a great presentation, Mr. Shadi, on American values, American exceptionalism, as I would say it. And so when we go into these negotiations, we always want everybody to have, you said, we want to do this because America, this is what America does. We create but not every other country does that. And so I get to my question, you said there's really no mechanism, Ms. Strickland, for that to happen. You say we won't accept, so make it kind of what Mr. Shimkus asked, but in this way, you said we won't accept any plan for Mr. Shadi or any group that's not accountable and transparent. So what parameters or what would you be looking for in terms of accountability and transparency? And I think Mr. Gross kind of answered that saying, well, we don't really know what it is because they haven't developed it yet. But we need to go in at least knowing what we know and knowing what we're looking for. And what would you be looking for in an accountable and transparent program?
We need to see, and again, ICANN has made great strides in this over the last several years. The fact that the multi-stakeholder community feels that the decisions that they're making, the policies that they're developing are being executed as they have directed them. And so we look to how ICANN actually performs in that respect. We look at what the mechanisms are that are in place to ensure that ICANN performs in that fashion. And again, this has been the subject of 2 accountability and transparency review teams that I have personally participated on in 2010 and 2013. And we will continue to push for those sorts of improvements throughout the next period of time while this plan's being put together and beyond, because as I said earlier, the organization can always find ways to improve in that regard.
But when you look for something transparent, there's some specific going in that I want to see that they're able to allow us to have annual public audits. Or Mr. Hadi, what would you offer up as these are going to show that the ICANN organization that you chair would be transparent in a way that's a solid plan to know not only that it can't happen now, but it concerns what happens when we're all gone. 20 years, to get to Mr. Shimkus's model, I think Mr. Yeltsin signed the Budapest Memorandum where Putin didn't get the memorandum. And so how do we kind of ensure this going further? And those are the kind of the concerns we have, and they're real concerns.
Yeah, and they're real concerns, and they're ones we take seriously. I want to assure you of that. We do not belittle the possibility of us going into the wrong mode. So we have to be alert. We have to be vigilant. We need all these companies that supported this move to remain engaged, because they have been for 15 years, and to watch what we do. From my side, operationally, I need to make sure that every part of this process is open, is transparent, is inclusive, that we don't simply do it in a suburb, hiding in a room, and people around the world can't see what's happening. They need to participate. We have remote participation at these meetings, multiple translation, meaning inclusivity, openness, and transparency have to underpin this process, or it's not legitimate to this government or to anybody in the world. And that's our commitment.
And I'll just say that I got my last 20 seconds. So when we're speaking, and speaking from our role in the government, we do know that we are exceptional, and Americans expect freedom and opportunity and things that are forward. And we also know that other governments don't have that, and it's internal to their governments, they're doing it now. What we're doing now is not preventing them from doing it. We understand that, but that's what people understand. So we've got to be very careful and very transparent, very accountable if this process moves forward, so people can be confident that we're going to have the same opportunities that we have without relinquishing our American exceptionalism or our American ideals to an international body. Thanks. I just ran out of time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes 5 minutes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the distinguished panel. I would like the panel to know that I've received a good deal of correspondence on this issue, and certainly those in the district I serve are concerned about the situation, and I want to work to the greatest extent possible to allay the concerns of the constituents whom I represent. And the district is a well-educated district and certainly wants access to the greatest extent possible across the globe. I support Mr. Shimkus's legislation. To you, Secretary Strickling, if the legislation were to pass both houses of Congress and reach the president, I know you've indicated, sir, that you're neither for it nor against it. Would you, at the least, not oppose it if it were to reach the president's desk?
Well, Congressman, I think, as you know, administration positions on legislation are developed through a process that hasn't happened yet on this bill, so I couldn't speak to that.
Thank you. Certainly, Mr. Shimkus doesn't need me to lobby for his legislation, but I do support his legislation, and I would hope that the administration might work in a cordial fashion with Mr. Shimkus as the situation moves forward.
So as I told the congressman, and I'll repeat to you and to the other members, we're committed to keeping this committee advised and informed of this process as we work our way through it. We expect to be up here on a regular basis, perhaps not with all of our friends and neighbors, but we will do what we can to keep you advised and informed of the process as it moves forward.
Thank you, Secretary. To that end, I do have a question, and perhaps you've just answered it. You are willing to advise Congress of the proposals submitted for the transition and commit, I would hope, to delay action until you have briefed Congress on the consequences of accepting any of the proposals.
We will keep you fully informed, yes, sir.
Thank you. To the other distinguished members of the panel, I want to reiterate the concerns of my constituents, and I would like to work in a fashion where we are effective to make sure that this be as open a process as possible. And obviously it is the unanimous view of members of this subcommittee, I would presume of members of the House and Senate, that we want an open and transparent process, recognizing that freedom across the globe is essential as we move forward in this area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thanks very much. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. And seeing no other members here to ask questions, I want to thank, on behalf of Chairman Walden, our distinguished panel for being here today. Appreciated it. And we'll now panel our second panel. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We'll convene the second panel at this time, and the chair would first like to recognize Steve Del Bianco, the Executive Director of Net Choice, and we appreciate you being here, and the mic is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. If you look back across 16 years and 3 different administrations, I think you'll see that our government has protected ICANN and helped it to mature. You might also see that the U.S. cannot retain that unique role forever. And you might also admit that politics today are forcing a discussion to begin on the transition. You've heard complicated concepts and acronyms all morning long, so how about a simple analogy? Think of a car and a driver. So the top-level domain table, think of it as a car. It was designed and built here in the USA in 1990, and the license plate on this car reads IANA, IANA. In 1998, we asked for a designated driver on this car, and we created ICANN to fulfill that role. Then we handed the car keys to ICANN, and giving them the authority to make policies while driving that car, but we monitored what they did and the care of the car. Then in 2009, we figured ICANN was mature enough to be given some independence, and we did that under the affirmation of commitments. But all along, the U.S. government retained the title to that car. The IANA title was kept by the U.S. That became leverage for us to hold ICANN accountable for the symbolic powers that Secretary Strickling mentioned earlier. NTIA's announcement that you're debating today doesn't say what happens to the title for IANA. It doesn't say it at all. It's possible that the community proposal would have NTIA sign the title over to ICANN, but that's not a foregone conclusion. It might be that we sign the title over to an independent multi-stakeholder entity that could then hold ICANN accountable the way NTIA has for 16 years. Now, NTIA's principles for the transition are great as far as they go, but to hold ICANN accountable and to prevent government capture after we sign over the title, we need more than just principles. We have to ask how any proposed mechanism would respond to potential scenarios or stress tests. So back to the car and driver analogy, we can tell our teenagers about the good principles of driving carefully in the winter, but it's a stress test to have them respond to having the car spin sideways on a snow-covered road. In today's testimony, I suggested several stress tests and use case scenarios, and our task is to develop accountability mechanisms that could answer to those tests at least as effectively as the mechanism we have today, the NTIA oversight. So I mentioned stress tests in there, like what if ICANN lacked the financial or technical capability to actually execute its obligations? Who would rescue the route in that case? I gave richer examples in there, like example scenarios 6 and 7 on internet censorship. Today, censorship happens at the edge of the internet, where governments can block a domestic access to a website. As you know, Turkey's blocking Twitter inside the country, even though the rest of the world can see twitter.com. But consider a stress test where censorship migrates from the edge of the internet to the core of the internet, which is the route table that we're talking about here, that's used by the entire world. ICANN's Government Advisory Committee, or GAC you heard today, they can change their operating procedures at any time. They can change from the consensus they have today to majority voting, which is what they're used to at the United Nations. There were only 61 governments who showed up at the ICANN Singapore meeting, so 31 governments would have been enough for a majority. So let's say those governments advise ICANN that the new TLD.corrupt, the .corrupt top-level domain, must get government permission for any domain that matches the name of a government official. After all, top-level domains already need that kind of permission for city and territory names in new top-level domains. So it seems like a relatively easy matter for them to approve a brand new policy on permission. The question is, what would ICANN's board do in that stress test? If the future board felt very seriously threatened by the ITU and the UN, as Ms. Rossini will warn you in a moment, then it might not have the guts to reject that kind of advice coming from governments. So how could our new mechanism resist that pressure? It should be at least as strong as the present arrangement, where a government with First Amendment in its DNA would reject censorship in the DNS. So I'll conclude by saying most of the questions you've asked today probably can't be answered today. So we have to continue the process of developing proposals, and then we can ask how each of those proposals would answer the stress tests and questions. We can design a new accountability mechanism for ICANN, possibly with independent and external safeguards. And above all, let's be realists about the risks as we head down this road, but let's begin as optimists that we can arrive safely. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony today, and the chair now recognizes for 5 minutes Carolina Rossini, Project Director of the Internet Governance and Human Rights Program at the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. Welcome.
Members of the Subcommittee, sirs and madams in the audience, I'm very pleased to testify before you today. The views I share with you today are those of the Open Technology Institute at New America Foundation, but also of public knowledge. Although I speak only for OTI and PK, I'm also a member of a broader US-based coalition of public interest nonprofits brought together to advocate for internet governance systems that preserves the open, free, generative, and global internet. Organizations that have a vested interest in promoting the free flow of information online. This coalition is guided by human rights principles and evolves based on processes that are democratic, inclusive, open, transparent, and consensus-based, what we often call multi-stakeholder processes. We share concerns that in this transition, the internet must continue to be an open platform for the free exercise of human rights online, and we believe this move could help hinder government overreach in internet governance, which would have harmful implications for human rights worldwide. This is a critical step in the history of the global network of networks. 3 are my main key points today. First, we welcome the Department of Commerce proposed transfer of oversight of the key internet domain name functions to the global multi-stakeholder community, which we are part of. This represents a fulfillment of many years of US promises to the private sector, technical experts, and international community at large. We have cleared that the NTIA will not accept a proposal that replaces its role with government-led or any intergovernmental organization schemes. And we commend the NTIA to not forego its contract with ICANN if a set of 4 principles previously mentioned and explained is not met by the final proposal. A transition on this set of terms would be fully consistent with prior bipartisan anonymous policy by the Congress that has sought to preserve and advance the multi-stakeholder governance model under which the internet has thrived. Those resolutions were an act of US leadership, and I stress that, international leadership, in the advance of the Wicked conference a couple of years ago. Second, we encourage the subcommittee to view the oversight of the DNS system through the lens of human rights, freedom of expression, and the spread of democratic ideals around the globe. Yesterday's resolution, authored by members of the subcommittee calling for internet freedom in Turkey, is a proof that we are on the same page. And today, we call for that vision to be spread and applied through all of the layers of the internet. Third, we believe that if proposed transfers do not go through, the geopolitical outcomes can be disastrous. Forestalling the transfer of the IANA functions to the global multi-stakeholder community could further empower critics who favor a governance model, a governmental or intergovernmental model of internet governance, whether implemented through the ITU, excuse me, or some other government-dominated non-multi-stakeholder body. In this current international context, the .com Act may actually place into the hands of those who use the internet as an instrument of political control. My final remarks. The pragmatic truth is that the United States cannot afford to maintain the symbolic control indefinitely. A change is going to come. The question is what change and in what form? We at the OTI and PK, supported by a broad coalition of US and international public interest nonprofits, welcome the Department of Commerce plans, and we will watch closely and engage deeply in all the venues of engagement, ensuring that the transition meets, as we all hope, standards of inclusiveness, openness, transparency, and accountability. In the meantime, we welcome the subcommittee interest in this complex issue and look forward to working with its members to ensure the security, stability, reliance, and freedom of the global internet. As Ambassador Gross mentioned, the world is watching. Thank you so much for your time and for your trust.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony today. We appreciate it. And I'll start with my 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Rosini, you appear to be claiming in your testimony that if the transfer does not occur, the near-term geopolitical outcome will be a transfer of functions anyway to a specialized agency of the United Nations subject to political control. If this is in fact the case, doesn't that inform us of the dire necessity of making sure that the process that the administration is about to undertake is a sound one, and that safeguards are in place to protect against that outcome after the transition is complete?
Yes, I agree with that statement.
Okay.
I do believe, though.
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I do believe, though, that we have to understand the timing and if any actions for stalling that transition can cause in terms of the symbolic movement of U.S.
Did you want to make a comment on that, Mr. Del Bianco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The mechanism for what Mr. Rossini is talking about would have been instructive on the previous panel, this notion that the United Nations might adopt a resolution indicating that it's got an agency that should take over. In today's world, since we do hold the title, we do hold control of the route, any attempt to do that is a non-starter in today's world. It's the post-transition world where we no longer hold that title, that the entities we charge with it have to be strong enough to resist that. So the mechanisms of takeover, I gave you one with respect to the governments changing the way they vote within ICANN, within the institution of ICANN. Ms. Rossini has talked about threats from without, outside of ICANN. And again, both cases call for us to create stress tests that can resist that.
Thank you. Mr. Del Bianco, if I could follow up with another question then to you. If the NTIA role in overseeing the IANA contract is ministerial, minor, and has no real impact on day-to-day operations of ICANN or the Internet, as Mr. Shahadi stated, what impacts would this transition really have?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To call it symbolic, it does not mean that it doesn't exist. Symbolic just means we have to ask another question about what it means. In 2010, after the affirmation of commitments was signed, the then chairman of ICANN told a group in Europe that he viewed the affirmation of commitments as a temporary document that he'd like to terminate. So frankly, it's the fact that we hold the title, the fact that NTIA's supervision is there, that keeps ICANN from leaving the affirmation of commitments, that keeps ICANN honoring the obligations they have under the affirmation. And I'm reassured when the president of ICANN today says that we'll live by the affirmation. We won't quit it because it's working well, and I agree. But he won't be the president of ICANN forever. There's an ebb and flow of powers and pressures in a geopolitical environment. The question is, what holds ICANN to live within the affirmation? That is a symbolic value, you could call it that, but it's quite real and has effect right now. Because the affirmation of commitments was cited by everyone on the previous panel as the real constitution that keeps ICANN truly accountable and transparent to the world.
Okay, let me follow up with another question to you then. What role can the nonpartisan research entities like GAO and CRS play in this process?
Mr. Chairman, a GAO review, similar to what I saw in the Shimkus Blackburn bill, could explore what these four principles mean, explore what the words multi-stakeholder and open of the Internet. That would be very helpful to get an exploration of fleshing out those terms as we, the community, design these processes. And the GAO might, or Congress might also help to devise these stress tests that I delineated in my testimony. I only put 8 of them in there. We may need a few more. And as the stress tests are put together, the community can then use those to figure out whether the proposals are going to work. I think Chairman Upton said he characterized these bills as something in terms of hitting the brakes. I would characterize it differently. It would be better if GAO helped us to design a crash test for the vehicles that we have to test, as opposed to hitting the brakes on the process.
Thank you. Ms. Rosini, what role do you think that public interest and civil society groups such as yours play in this transition, and how can you encourage a good outcome in that transition process?
Since many years, Mr. Chairman, civil society has engaged actually since the very first creation of ICANN. Members of the Berkman Center that then went on to public interest organizations helped form ICANN, informed its bylaws. So historically, we are deeply involved. We are also deeply involved through committees of representation that are driven by consensus building norms, and we are also informed by the bylaws when we participate on those. We can also inform decisions through participation in IGF, which is non-decision making, but it is important for us to set the rules on how we are talking about concepts and so on. And we can also engage even in multilateral forums, informing the countries on those fora. So there are many avenues for engagement, participating in a more decisive decision at the end.
Well, thank you very much, and my time has expired, and I now recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. It seems that a lot of my colleagues here that have expressed concern is that some future board of ICON 20 years from now or somewhere in the future that would be influenced by some repressive government to somehow restrict access to the internet. And, you know, I was reading an article here from Weekly Standard that really questions really how powerful ICON is. And I just want to read from the statement. It says, contrary to dark speculations by various conservative commentators, ICANN can't really facilitate internet censorship in China and Iran to please those governments. ICANN can't stop them from doing that now. Nor is there any plausible scenario in which ICANN imposes censorship on U.S. websites. Actual websites operate through 13 root servers, some still directly run by U.S. government agencies, some by U.S. universities, and some by U.S. private companies. It would be no technical challenge for them to bypass ICANN and coordinate amongst themselves. Politically, it's really unimaginable that they would all bow to Chinese pressure for censorship because ICANN told them to do so. How do you react to a statement like that? And I mean, if the root servers are controlled by mostly American governments, private companies, and universities, what can ICANN really do to force them to somehow censor the internet in the United States?
What the root servers contain, Representative, is a set of the top-level domains, the .com, .net, .mil, .org, and 200 brand new ones that have just come along, as well as the country code. And we're still having 800 or 1,100 more coming in the next year. Each of those new top-level domains was approved by ICANN. And the ICANN Government Advisory Committee, we call it the GAC here, came up with the disapproval of a few. For instance, they said that .islam should not go into the root. So that means it doesn't go into the main root. It doesn't go into any of those root servers, wherever they're controlled. So the top-level domains that are approved, that responsibility lies with ICANN, and then ICANN hands it over and puts it in the root. And as I mentioned earlier, that root, the U.S. government has custody of that through IANA, and that is what we're transitioning to some other body. So the censorship that we're speaking of is whether labels, like the top-level domain of a government official's name, .corrupt, would still be allowed to exist. And there are pernicious ways in which to achieve that. One can attach rules, and I mentioned in my testimony that the ICANN makes the rules. And today, you cannot light up Washington any top-level domain without the permission of that city, that country, or that territory name. So those are the kind of rules that allow governments to expand their control of the labels that are used for websites. And I know they do so in their own countries today. The question is, how do we prevent that? And we can prevent that from sneaking its way into controlling the root at the top level.
But there's no way that ICON has no power to force any of these root servers to do what it says. I mean, they could easily just bypass ICON and coordinate amongst themselves. Is that not true?
That's an interesting proposal. That might be one of the proposals that comes back. The root server operators are an independent group of technology companies.
Right.
They may well suggest a proposal for they taking title to the root as opposed to giving it to ICANN. We'll wait and see. But the questions you ask are hypotheticals that might be answered by a proposal. And I think those hypothetical questions are exactly what we need in terms of stress tests.
Thank you. Let me ask another. Mr. Shimkus's legislation, I don't know whether the panelists have been provided a copy of Mr. Shimkus' legislation to read it, but one of the concerns I have no problems with the GAO doing a study. I do have a problem with the fact that it delays the process for a year, or it could delay the process for up to a year, is written in. What impact do you think that would have if this process could be delayed up to a year while the GAO conducts a study? Ms. Rossini?
Mr. Bianco asked me to go first. So I think that this year we see a couple of very important milestones in this process. We have the Net Mundial coming in Brazil end of this month, and we also have the plenary of ITU coming later in November. So you're going to have two very important meetings in this moment where we are trying to define the principles of the internet governance ecosystem. And if that announcement, if that symbolic announcement that actually has a lot of geopolitical weight to it is not made clear and is not a real commitment of US, we can have a very difficult outcome, some very difficult outcomes from these meetings. The ITU meeting coming out, you're gonna have them, the voices of those governments that are non-democratic governments, that can speak much louder than they would be able to speak here or even in Net Mundial, which will be a multi-stakeholder government. And we, as civil society, we have a range of actors acting from protesters in the street to media strategy to expert advisory. I am part actually of the Global Commission on Internet Governance that was announced in the WEF. So we have a lot of ways to engage to be sure that the results of those meetings are well received and also in agreement with the open internet. So the announcement, we need your help to make those meetings work for an open internet. So
I see my time is up, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
Well, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate following my friend from Pennsylvania. Mr. Jihadi had said in his testimony, in his written testimony, that in his testimony he mentioned that the importance of not rushing this process. That's his testimony. So I think it's important for us to get it right, and I think we've got to have comfort with this. I mean, I understand the international push, but we've done numerous things in this government, rushing, and then being embarrassed by the results of rushing through the process. So Government Accountability Office, as I said, is the Inspector General for us. I mean, I think it's really the least, we should at least do is have another pair of eyes on this process, answering a lot of the questions that Mr. Del Bianco had mentioned. Ms. Rossini, thank you for coming. The first two questions are kind of part of your written testimony. In your testimony, you say that my bill, the .com Act, seeks to block the transition in the name of human rights. Can you cite the part of the bill that says that?
can you repeat the part?
Yeah, in your written testimony, you say that the .com Act seeks to block the transition in the name of human rights. You say
Yes.
that this bill is really an anti-human rights bill, I think.
No, thank you, Mr. Representative, first for reading my complete written testimony. And I think that's not my understanding of what I have written there. My concern is that if we wait 1 year, if we block the transition now and wait 1 year until we have a report, that is the risk. And that's the risk that we're going to have for non-democratic governments to actually make their voices even louder and manipulate the narrative, both in Net Mundial and in the pluripot in November.
But, and if I may, because I've got another question I want to follow up, so I appreciate that, because that was kind of maybe an answer I was expecting from the first panel, but in essence, they didn't give me that.
Yeah.
They basically said, we support another look. Transparency, good review. Fortunately for us, I think they in essence endorsed the bill. And because they could have responded a different way.
And one thing I would do, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
One thing that I actually would add to that is that if U.S. has supported through bipartisan unanimous consensus the resolutions that foster multi-stakeholder, this statement, this report could come as one stakeholder input, not to hold the process back. So you're gonna have a voice. U.S. has a strong
But you
voice.
understand that doing a review by the Government Accountability Office would take some time. If we believe, you heard the concerns out here, and I think some of them are, I mean, as the internet has changed over the decades, so has the world community. I think the people would credibly argue that the world's a more dangerous place today, not a safer place today. So, these aren't crazy things to ask and review. Let me turn to Mr. Del Bianco to address that concern and the concern about another government look.
Congressman, the members of NetChoice are concerned that we send the wrong signal by simply hitting the brakes or having a delay. And yet, we think you're sending the right signal by asking questions about defining the terms in the four principles. What does the term mean, multi-stakeholder, meeting the needs and expectations? What does openness mean? More importantly, what are the risks to those four principles and the risk of government influence associated with new proposals? So that is exactly how I believe we can channel the kind of energy that you and Congresswoman Blackburn have brought here, channel that energy into having GAO begin now at articulating what they think definitions that are appropriate for accountability and the risks, because that will allow us in the community who are designing proposals to test those proposals against the risks that Congress and the GAO have identified. Those should begin in parallel, because we started last week in Singapore to design multiple proposals, and you wouldn't believe the email traffic that's already gone on since we left Singapore. Thousands of email messages with different groups, not all ICANN, different groups coming up with proposals. And over 18 months, plus potentially two-year extensions, we'll have the opportunity to narrow that down to a short list of proposals. I would benefit from having your work, the work of GAO, or anybody in the U.S. government at articulating the risks we want to avoid.
And I would just end, Joe Barton stole the phrase I was going to use, Ronald Reagan, trust, but verify. And all this is a verification of what everybody says is going to happen is actually going to happen. Yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add one brief thing for the record? It will take 3 seconds.
That's, gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I just want to state for the record that I did not hear any of the panelists in the first panel endorse Mr. Shimkus's legislation.
And then,
Mr. Shimkus?
if I may, I would say I hope my colleague was at the first panel, and they definitely did not oppose the bill.
Okay, but they didn't endorse it either.
Okay,
That's debatable.
okay. Thank you, gentlemen. I want to thank on behalf of Chairman Walden for your testimony today. We greatly appreciate you being here and testifying before us today. And seeing no other business to come before the committee, the subcommittee this afternoon, the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you.